Hello Whisky fans, care to join me for a dram? Why not, right? Why not? Today is December the 15th, which is somewhere on this calendar. Double height one over there. So we're in the last 10 now. It's going to be tricky to open without ripping it. Okay, so what do we want to see today? Quite fancy something else peated. 18-year-old peated whiskey. That sounds good. Smells good. Doesn't smell peated yet. Let's get it in the glass and have a closer look. A lot of these whiskies do seem to have a very similar colour. There's been a few very light ones, but there's also been quite a few that probably aren't coloured. I think more than else that probably teaches us that when these distilleries colour whiskey, they're trying to make you think, or trying to make it appear like an 18 or a very well aged whiskey, or a sherried whiskey. But in all honesty, what these distilleries have in their minds when they decide to dump a load of caramel colouring into a whiskey is anyone's guess really, isn't it? So I think the nose on this one is quite focused. And I may possibly have been wrong about this not being peated, because there may be a little bit of a dirty smokiness. I'm not quite sure yet. I'd say definitely that little bit narrower and more focused, a little bit subtler, and maybe possibly even a touch more shy than some of the other whiskies we've had in the calendar. Definitely getting some old maltiness though. It's definitely some evidence that there's some old casks gone into there, and I'd say it's more of an obvious old maltiness. So I'm getting notes of oily, nutty old malt, malt whiskey that's been in a cask for quite a while, and malt whiskey that's picked up quite, not a huge amount, not overly so, but it's picked up quite a bit of tannins and a little touch of bitterness from the cask. Also getting quite a strong aroma of leather, like old leather armchair, and sort of French polish, furniture polish, and that sort of tanned leathery smell. Quite a bit of sherry, but definitely not a sherry finish. I think this is a whiskey that I'm not sure if it's been matured full term in some, maybe a refill sherry cask, or it's a whiskey where there's been some old sherry casks, full term maturation sherry casks that have been put into the vatting. It's quite, I think this is really opening up in the glass. I'm putting a little bit of heat into it with my hand there, and also just letting it breathe for a few minutes, and it's really opening up quite well. Because it did seem a little bit narrow and focused at first, but the more I nose it, it's really coming to life. What I will say though is I'm going to learn from yesterday's mistake, where I guessed that the Glenfarclas 21 was a 46% craft presentation, and it's not. Apparently it's 43%. With this one, I think that this is probably older than average from what we've seen in the Advent calendar so far. I'd probably guess around 20 years, but I would probably guess that the ABV doesn't seem like a craft presentation. I'd probably guess 43% on the ABV. Lots of that nuttiness coming through now. The old malt notes are getting stronger and stronger as I nose it. Strong appliness. It's got a pleasant freshness, because it does smell quite old, but it's also got lots of that fresh green apple spiritiness. So, at least on the nose, it's a very well balanced old whisky. Let's see how it tastes. So, I think I would agree that probably 43%, because it's not overwhelmingly powerful on the palate, the same as it wasn't overwhelmingly powerful on the nose. Although the same as the Glenfarclas from yesterday, it does seem to suffer a little bit more on the palate than the nose, but still very good whisky. More sweet appley notes on the palate, the same as I found on the nose. Those creamy strawberry sweets that you can get, I don't know if that's going to mean anything to you, but confectionery, creamy, strawberry. Also getting some sort of caramel honey notes. And I swear it's not the whiskey playing tricks on me, but it seems like every time I go back to nose it, this one has grown a little bit more. Let's have another sip. I don't think it's quite got that intensity that you would get from a craft presentation, but I think this one is going to be probably one of the older whiskies in the Advent calendar. Maybe at least 20 years old, maybe 21 years old, the same as the Glenfarclas from yesterday. Getting lots of old maltiness. And as I said, every time I go back to it, that the age and the maturity seems to have grown that little bit more. So what do I think this is? Probably Speyside again. It's definitely got notes of the Speyside character to it. Maybe like a very old, independently bottled Tamnavulin, maybe. I really like with this one that it's got those obvious old malt notes with some sort of slightly bitter tannin notes, but they just go together perfectly with the fresh green apple spirity sweetness. It's a hard one to pin down. Let's not waste any more time. Let's find out what it is. I think the problem with Speyside whiskies and whiskies that have that Speyside character is there's so many of them that when you're trying to guess in a blind tasting, you quite often can't see the wood for the trees. So let's do it. Let's see what we've got. So this is an old familiar friend. I think this is actually the winner from last year's Whisky Advent calendar. I don't know if that's going to focus there. It usually doesn't, because the camera does not like to be helpful. I don't know what it's trying to focus on there, but it's not the bottle. This is the Perspective Series 21-year-old from Berry Brothers and Rudd. Blended Scotch whisky. So this was the big surprise and the big upset in last year's Whisky Advent calendar, because there was quite a bit of wild whisky in the standard calendar last year, but not that many blends, I don't think. And this one, I think I gave the number one spot, even though it is a blended Scotch, and even though it's 43%. I think I said when I was tasting that this one, I did actually guess 43%, but I think it's a whisky that does better than most, despite the low strength. And I think that's really evidence that Berry Brothers, they're really putting some quality casks into this series of whisky. And those 21 years have not been in vain, because this is a fantastically aged blended Scotch whisky. So I'm glad I didn't crap all over that one, because that would have been embarrassing, seeing as I gave this the #1 spot last year. Although you have to remember that this is the premium whisky advent calendar, so it has got a lot more competition this year than it did last year. So is this going to be this year's #1 as well, 2 years in a running? Competition is pretty stiff in this one, so I'm going to say probably not. But it's a very good one, and it's definitely going to be up there. I look forward to hearing from you guys what you thought of this one, if you were lucky enough to be tasting this along with me today, and I'll see you tomorrow.